Hello.
Anyway.
Hello.
Are you in the office, Mac?
I am. Are you? Are you just like outside?
Yeah. No, I'm outside on the 5th floor.
Nice. I was like, that's some fancy brick you got there.
I wish.
Should we get started?
Sure.
Looks like the first one is Max. I don't know if we have anything else to discuss.
Yeah, I don't think I added this. I'm happy to talk about it. I'm just curious if anyone's willing to fess up for who Volin told me.
I think we added as a reminder from last week. Or maybe we can check about the PR. I think you already commented on the controller runtime. There's an existing PR.
Yeah. It's just someone did some footwork tracking this, which is cool. I didn't actually look up Oren's original PR, so I'm glad someone found that. So in October 13th, 2020, it was closed because they were trying to figure out what to do with the notion of stoppable controllers. Okay, so, and it seems like the thread got dead until this PR, which seems to not the allow removing. Wait, individual informers from the cat. Okay, so there's two.
I think Vince
PRs.
responded that he's gonna look at he's gonna continue to work on that PR.
Yeah.
Looks like.
Right, the comment that I had left yesterday, you're saying?
Yeah, so yay.
The more like non-3-year-old information. Yeah, it seems like it. I'm glad it was supportive or appeared to be supportive of at least the notion. I hope that they would be willing to do the probably more simpler thing in its own PR, which is essentially the ability to remove an informer, which is really the only thing we personally as a project, or we gatekeeper needs, because the watch manager essentially does all the rest of what they're trying to do with like the stoppable controllers and all that. And that would be sufficient for us to get rid of the fork. And looking at the state of the code, it's also possible if we wind up switching to this forked logic, or sorry, switching to the new logic that Kubernetes has written and stop relying on our forked stuff, we might be able to pretty significantly simplify Watch Manager, because a lot of the complex stuff around Watch Manager is when you have a new listener, you want to replay all the events, you want to manage the locking appropriately so that you make sure you're not missing events as things thrash. And Core K8s, with their more recent work, is taking care of that, right? So that would be cool. That would essentially make a lot of the complex bits redundant. I still would do the Watch Manager registrar model, just because that's that reference counting thing that controller manager is trying to solve. The other thing I'm thinking about for that just slipped out of my brain. Shoot. Yeah, anyway, Watch Manager would be impacted. Oh, right. It might also change. Would it change this? Potentially. Right now we're piping everything using events, right? Like Golang, and now all the words are leaving my head. Channels, right? We register a Golang channel and pipe events to the constraint controller. To use the Core K8 stuff, that model may need to change slightly. But anyway, that's just me being 20% familiar with what's happening on the K8 side and trying to map what the effort would look like if we wanted to go full bore.
And just to confirm that, something we will need to work on after controller runtime merges that PR, and then we use the latest controller runtime, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is assuming that they are okay with creating just a remove listener command, or remove informer cache command. Because literally that's all we need. And all the Watch Manager stuff that I talked about, that's just further simplification. But that also is not in that controller runtime PR yet, right? So that's where maybe some convincing needs to be done. Maybe we can, if they agree in principle, but they really want to have this shiny controller stuff so that people don't need to engage with it as carefully as we have with our homegrown approach. Then if we can convince them to do a staged development process so we could get those bits sooner, that would be the sort of convincing risk that I see, political risk, let's call it.
Do we know why they wouldn't want to remove?
So the reason why I don't think it will be that controversial is they will need the remove eventually, no matter what. The reason why they may not want to have the remove with something like a shiny pane of glass in front of it would be essentially the reasons why Oren's original PR was put on ice, was that there are definitely lots and lots of ways that you can shoot yourself in the foot if you do not handle the constructing or deconstructing of global resources appropriately. Right, it's just an invitation for a race condition. If you have two controllers, one of which decides, oh, I no longer need to watch this thing, let me delete that informer, but the other controller's no, I still needed that, right? Which is why we have Watch Manager. And there's other like nuances that you can find in other places in the codes. I'm forgetting these specific places, but you can find, there's in our registrar a command where it's like remove if watching. And that allows us to do a locked check around the set of watched resources. I think this is maybe used in audit is one place, probably in other places as well, where we want to be absolutely sure that we're not querying a resource that is mid its watch being torn down, because otherwise we run the risk of accidentally reconstructing that watch post deconstruction and essentially causing a memory leak. Yeah, so to put that in a bow, that's the sort of complexity that, you know, we were happy to take on because it let us do a lot of stuff that we wanted to do. But if your goal is to create a sort of streamlined package that's easy to build complex stuff on top of, I could see the controller runtime people being a little hesitant. My argument to that would be, if this is just a new method on the Informer cache itself, how many people are accessing the Informer cache directly who aren't already sort of willing to take on that risk? Because for the most part, the Informer cache is encapsulated by all of the like controller.watch logic and the client.get and all of that code. And they'll need it anyway, so it'll exist.
Any other questions? Cool. Let's follow up on the PR then, and keep a watch.
Yeah, it's exciting that they've sort of taken it on, because that will very, very significantly simplify a lot of our infrastructure.
Well, especially by Vince, because he's a maintainer.
Yay.
Wait, by Vince, because he's a
Like,
maintainer?
he's a maintainer of, yeah. Like, it's different if, like, you know, the original PR author did it versus like the maintainer. You know what I'm saying? Like, yeah.
Yeah, that shows a certain amount of like endorsement at the direction level is I think what you're saying.
I'm hoping that's what this means.
Oh, almost certainly. Like so the cell cap, they don't, I mean, the core K8s library doesn't really use controller runtime, but the there is this dynamic watch element to the cell cap, and they're using this underlying ability to add and remove listeners. And I believe, I could be wrong about this, but they have their own Informer cache type thing where they can remove the Informer to avoid memory leaks. So at least the stuff that controller runtime is built on top of is starting to accept this sort of dynamic watch environment, which probably makes it easier for controller runtime to do as well. I think Rita might be frozen.
She's moving.
Oh, she's frozen for me.
Oh, I was gonna say maybe she's very still.
I'm here.
I can hear you. You look very contemplative in your frozen frame.
I think
If
it
that's
might
any
be just you. max, maybe.
Very possible. Other people are moving for me, but I wouldn't hesitate to blame my computer anyway.
Cool.
All right.
Should we move to the next one?
Sounds good.
Looks like Anlan is next with add sync annotation check or auto-generate config.
Yeah, so I already told you Sertaj, but Sertaj suggested that I might pick this up because I did the work on the Azure side for this. But we had kind of a change in personnel. So now I'm picking up implementing the mutation stuff for Azure. So that will maybe be on the back burner, but I'm still happy to pick it up. I think you've seen the code, so you probably have a sense of how much Sertaj is in the code. So probably has a sense of how much is reusable, but I think it would make sense, like especially the expansion and the validation to like for us to call out to Gatekeeper as a library ultimately, rather than having that exist in two different places. But anyway.
Which system, sorry, in two different places?
Sorry, the expansion for the require sync annotation. Like
Gotcha.
passing that into
Okay.
and expanding it. Yeah.
So I think when we looked at the library, where we add the annotation, I think we wanted to auto-generate in the Gatekeeper side. I think we talked about it in the last few calls. So the user wouldn't have to specify the sync resource, so we can eliminate it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can see at a high level this taking a couple of different paths, none of which are mutually exclusive, and this might be just a staged development kind of thing. I get the sense that people are kind of interested in this idea of if you apply a constraint template to a cluster, it will read these annotations and generate the syncs for you at that time, right? I think there's other instances where people might be interested in generating the sync objects shift left, right? And just applying it beforehand, which is probably a lower bar to get an MVP on because you don't need any of the controller development kind of stuff, which is where that stage development bit comes into play. And when it comes to like writing the controller, one thing I'm thinking about is, do we want syncs to live in a singular config object, or do we want to break out the notion of a sync to a separate resource? The advantage of having the syncs as a separate resource would be it'd be much easier to deal with each thing individually, right? You no longer need to like collate all constraint templates and compile the sync object and also keep track of which ones were written by humans so you don't accidentally clobber those. But instead you can like create, say, an owner reference to a constraint template or something like that, take advantage of K8s garbage collection, and just have like a one-to-one mapping or probably one-to-many mapping. Either. Depends how we write the resource. Between constraint template and sync config objects. Yeah, something to think about. It'd definitely be a change in how our config is handled, but it might simplify things, particularly separating out human from machine and avoiding controller fights, things like that.
And just clarify on the owner reference thing, were you saying that it would be like the constraint templates would be owners of the config resource?
Yeah, it's a thought. The benefit of that would be basically the same reason why we got rid of finalizers, right? Like if you were to have Gatekeeper, then remove it prior to cleaning up these sync objects, they would get cleaned up automatically if the constraint template was removed. I forget if you can have an owner reference from a namespace scoped resource to a cluster scoped resource, or if we want this to be a namespace scoped resource if we create it, because the sync object doesn't exist except in my imagination. Yeah, so that would be the benefit, is that things that happen while Gatekeeper is not running for whatever reason, either uninstalled or because like it got rebooted during an update or blah, 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 would be a bit more seamless. Yeah, actually you'd need a finalizer otherwise. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
If you wanted to like clean up. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. I'm trying to not have to do that. That would be nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember if like you can add a cluster scope thing as an owner to a namespace resource. I don't remember that. Seems kind of weird.
Yeah.
One of them is not valid. I just remembered that because I had to debug.
I think it got fixed. It was like a bug and it got fixed in one of the Kubernetes.
No, I think it was a bug before. It was not working as intended. Then they fixed it, and then I think we were relying on the bug for some reason, and it was not fun.
Yeah, well, I mean, we can make syncs cluster scoped resources too. The only reason config was namespace scoped is we were sort of hedging against the notion of what if someone wanted to install Gatekeeper multiple times. This is like 2018. So I don't think that particular path really seems likely now.
No, that ship has sailed. So would next step be like maybe a proposal doc?
Yeah, well, what do people think? Because we could try to go just full bore. I think the syncs things are probably, as much as that like raises the level of work in the short term, actually makes things simpler long term. But there's the other option of just generating the config for someone else to apply as like a middling step. So we have the logic there of how to interpret these things and how that translates into sync before we try to build out the like on cluster control plane bit.
Will we want like a step one to be just like a check to say, hey, you don't have these sync stuff installed?
Check could work.
Like a simple thing like, hey, we go look at the config resource. You don't have, I don't know, replica sets there. So we say that we cannot ingest this constraint template.
I'm trying to think what the impact would be if we wrote that check, then we moved to this other model. Like how much essentially not wasted, but write the code, then delete it right afterward would we get?
I mean, we can also keep the check and then have the auto generate as like a toggle. So if somebody doesn't want it, we still have the check.
That's fair. I was thinking more along the lines of how the check works might change if we change how syncs are described.
Right. I mean, I'm just saying that we don't have to get rid of the check, so it won't be wasted code if you have.
Right. The check itself, I agree. I was just thinking about how the check was implemented. That part might be thrashed a little bit. On the other hand, if we keep also allowing people to describe syncs in the config resource in addition to this other way, that would be, we kept the config resource as alpha because reasons like this, but still we don't necessarily have to make this a breaking change, which would tend to preserve the validity of that check logic. Because what might change, right, would be you reconcile a constraint template. As part of that reconcile, you query the state of the config resource. The other thing that would become salient would be if there's ever a change to the config resource, you would now want to reconcile all constraint templates. So you would have a chance to like unset that error state once someone adds the missing sync. And yeah, if we keep the sync also being described in config, all that would still be maintained. If we move sync out of there, that stuff would look different.
I think there's a lot of edge cases to consider. So for next step, can we start with the proposal doc and then we can comment in the doc, especially with the backward compatibility stuff. Yeah. Sounds good.
Yeah. Yeah, but I do request that in the doc, if we have some place where we could discuss, like, okay, do we want to, what's our MVP approach here?
Yeah, sounds good. Anand, are you okay to start a proposal on this when you get a chance?
Yeah, it may not be till end of February, depending on how the mutation stuff ends up. But yeah, I am.
Sounds good. Cool. If there are no other questions on this topic, then we can go to the pub sub.
I had some questions based on the feedback I got on.
Sorry, I'm getting very garbled audio. Is that true for everyone or is it just me?
Okay. Sorry, I haven't spoken for a very long time, so my voice was a little down. Yeah. Yeah, so based on the feedback I got, I had a couple of questions. So based on your comment, Max, the comment that sounds for enforcement action, sounds like we also want to do PubSub for different enforcement actions as well.
Eventually, yes. I'm not saying that's like a day zero thing, but it's on our radar, I think. Someone please object if they don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't want to put everything in that basket and then and then everything will be blocked until we have that.
Right. I would be more concerned with, because we're building like the groundwork for how to do PubSub, that the groundwork supports the sort of basic functionality required for doing that in the future.
Okay. And you also imagine multiple enforcement action would support PubSub, right?
What enforcement action would support PubSub?
We would like it won't be exclusive. Like we would have multiple enforcement action supporting PubSub, right? Like not only one at a time.
Yeah, like I it hasn't been designed, so it might look a little different, but I think it's fair to say that a core feature for a PubSub enforcement action would be choosing what queue it goes to, right? Like billings queue, securities queue, operations queue, whatever. And the thing I would not want to assume is that all queues use the same protocol, which implies necessarily that not all queues may use the same backing library, right? Some may work with Dapper, others maybe don't, right? So there should be some way of, based off of the queue cited, right, to route the call to whatever, let's call it messaging driver is appropriate for that queue. And that might be that the config, like the person who writes the enforcement action needs to specify the driver, be a little nicer if they didn't. But I don't think questions like that impact the like core bits, which is somewhere we need to, like on a per call basis, say send this to a specific queue in this driver versus send this to all registered queues, which is I think what you had said, and kind of what the metrics stuff does.
So you basically, let's say if it's a denied enforcement action, you want to send it to a Q1, and then if it's a warn, you want to send it to a Q2 kind of thing.
Well, the act of sending it to a queue would be its own enforcement action, but other than that, yes.
Okay, yeah, good. That makes sense. Okay, next one. Could you elaborate more on the comment that you left regarding interface implementation of the interface?
Sorry, I really can't hear. It's your audio really quiet.
Let me just listen. Can you hear me now clearly?
Yeah. Thank you.
I think my earphone had a problem. So my next question was to Rita. Could you elaborate your comment that you left implementation of interface?
Yeah, I was just commenting, and maybe this is just you combining code together in the same place, but ideally there should be like an interface and then the implementation of that interface, right? Whereas right now that block of code that you have in the doc, it looks like an implementation, right? It looks like the Dapper or RabbitMQ implementation. Yeah. It doesn't look like the interface itself, meaning if I want to add a new PubSub provider, how would I do it, right? I should be able to just take the interface and then just implement them, right?
Yeah. So yeah, that brings me to my next question. Should I open an issue or a design doc where we can discuss the same on GitHub? So it would be better to communicate rather than Google Docs, and better to update to me as well.
I mean, at this point, I think it might be easier to start a PR because I think that this is a little confusing with which part is interface, which one is not.
Or maybe we can just split it in the doc itself, saying like that, hey, this is the interface. An example, like this is like how you do it for Dapper or RabbitMQ, just so that it's like clear.
I would say if we do it as a PR, don't put like a lot of work into making the PR nice. Because at least for me, the first thing I'm going to look at is the shape of the interface. And like there's risk there around batching. I thought was pretty high risk because that affects the call pattern. Any sort of like configuration of how requests are handled that these underlying libraries support, we might want to handle at least some subset of those if there's like a common subset, and the routing thing, right? And other things like coupling and all that. So basically what I'm saying is that there's no need to like go deep into the code before we all agree on like the basic shape of the thing.
Okay. Yeah, I can open up a draft PR. It would be easier to get feedback on that rather than a Google Docs.
Yeah, like the only thing I'm just calling out is the interface itself should be a standalone. That's all.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, cool. And regarding batching, I had a couple of thoughts on how to implement batching. So there are two possibilities, right? Where we are calling out a publish function, we could have a logic to batch or construct an array of messages and then call out once we fulfill the batch size. Or we can just simply call out publish function and then have some mechanism in the publish function of each individual PubSub tool to fill up a batch, and until the batch is fulfilled, not call out the actual publish function that publishes the message to a queue. Which one would be more preferred?
So I heard like a third of that. I will say that for me, I'm missing a bit of knowledge in terms of like how the underlying libraries are supporting batching and what batching looks like at a protocol level, right? Because if batching is just something built on top of the basic protocol such that we define like a batched message structure, right? Then it's kind of moot from a interface level, right? Like either we develop a batched message structure or we don't. But if there's something special that the libraries do that
from the example I looked at, the Dapper and RabbitMQ, Dapper have incoming change that will do the same, but essentially what we will do is there are already defined interfaces and struct. We'll just pass down an array of it and call a specific function. But to construct that array or batch array of messages, we will need to have some criteria, right? Like the size of that array or let's say batch is decided by us. So if there are 20 violations in a array, we will just call out that publish method and publish those 20 violations and then wait for the next 20s. Does that make sense?
So let me try to parrot back what I just heard. You said, I believe, that the way these things work is they ask you to give like a batch size or to indicate otherwise when the batch is complete, and then they send the batch out at that point.
Yeah.
Is that fair? Okay. So then my question would be, so that's what it looks like in the center. When I'm a consumer of this message queue, do I see and ingest a batch in its entirety, or do I see each entry in the batch as its own discrete message?
Could you repeat yourself? Your sound was a little distorted.
Yeah. So if I am listening to RabbitMQ, right? So I'm on the consumer side of this equation now, and we're using batching. If I have a batch of 20 constraints or 20 responses, whatever those are, do I receive one listen event that has 20 responses, or do I receive 20 listen events?
From what I understood, I think you will receive only one event with 20 responses, not 20 individually.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of critical because it lets us know whether we're exporting the batching model to users or whether they're, yeah, it is hard to hear, sorry. I'm trying to, I think I'm getting the gist though. But if we're exporting the batching model to users, right, such that they need to be aware that there might be one or more messages in every message, then we may as well just ignore the batching functionality and write our own schema that allows for batching, right? And that would be uniform and not depend on which driver supports what. If, however, there's some like nice feature where it allows you to decouple how the sender is batching things versus how the receiver receives it, right? So like the sender can send out, like, let's say, batches of 5 messages per, and the receiver can say, send me things once you have 50 things to send me. That's genuinely like useful and unique and probably implemented at the protocol level. And that would be something that I at least would be interested in preserving, because that asymmetry can be pretty powerful.
Okay. But that, so there comes a question with it, right? Like, we don't know all the PubSub tools we want to support will support the same functionality that you just described.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a question we will definitely need to like deal with. And that can probably be done at the interface level, maybe some sort of like metadata associated with a, I forget what you called it, but like a broadcast call. Let's say the function on the interface was called, like, you could say use batching or don't use batching or whatever, or try to batch, and then a fallback for what happens if batching doesn't exist. Maybe it's like we require people whose drivers don't support batching to have some middleware that bundles things. I don't know. But the key, like, missing information is like, is there any like unique value to batching as implemented by Dapper that we couldn't just replicate by having our own schema that basically hard codes the batch?
It's really, actually, there is a lot to track when it comes to Dapper batching, because there are a lot of changes. So it's hard to follow those. But I am not even sure that when 1.10 is going to come on, but I'll definitely try to go into a little more details on how they are implementing to understand it better and determine what value it brings, and how, like, even if what, just like you described, what value it brings, and do we want to use that the implementation they are doing or not.
Yeah, and the reason why I'm harping so much on this, sorry for doing it, but is that we're creating a user-facing API kind of implicitly with the shape of how these messages are consumed. And so we really don't want to break that if we can avoid that. And part of that is knowing, you can't know the future, but if you at least know there is a future and there are plans, you could see what the range of the plans are.
Yeah.
Can we wrap batch in a function as part of the, like, maybe that's why I wanted to know how these.
I think based on what I'm hearing, I feel like because we don't know and we can't anticipate everyone to implement it the same way, I think having like a front end to how it's actually implemented, like a wrapper, then you could call the specific batch functionality if, let's say, Dapper has it, or if it doesn't, whoever's adding that support can add it, and which could be its own implementation, or maybe like a reference implementation, right? If none of the, let's say if Dapper doesn't have it, then you can add your own, I guess. But having it as part of interface ensures that we have something.
Yeah, I just would like literally just links to the designs that Dapper is looking at, so I have something concrete to base my thoughts off of in terms of like how it would be good to build it into the interface, because I could see that working like really well, or just not being compatible with how batch works, or maybe there was some simpler way it could have been done. It's just hard to know without knowing what the Dapper stuff is actually expecting and what it does.
Yeah, I guess then for the next actionable item for me to raise a draft PR with the code I have.
Yeah, and just post some links to the docs you found for Dapper. Like, I'm happy to read them. You don't need to digest them or anything like that. I just am wanting to.
Yeah, I'll link those docs on the PR itself as well. Or should I link them? I'll link them on Slack as well and on the PR as well, so it's easier for. And I'm sorry about microphone. I'll try different kinds of headphones next time to see if I can make it better. Sorry.
You are the first person in all of these 3 years who's had technical issues with their microphone. Certainly not me every time I join a meeting.
That's okay.
Cool. Are we moving on then, or?
So just a quick recap, what are the next steps? So to create a PR, Jaded?
Yes, I'll create PR. I'll link what I have read about Dapper and RabbitMQ and all the links I can find for batching, or at least the examples, and then we can go from there.
Cool.
The code you wrote for me was hard to follow. Like, I had to debug for a day or so to understand what it was doing.
Which one?
The code for supporting a different metrics backend. Whoever wrote it, it was hard to follow. Like, I had to debug a whole day to understand what it was doing.
Oops, that would be me.
I think that's true for a lot of code in Gatekeeper. Unfortunately.
Yeah, Kubernetes generally, like documentation of the how things are arranged is a pretty
There's no docs
slim.
in Kubernetes. What are you talking about?
There's like the user-facing docs are good. But the
Gatekeeper is a lot simpler in comparison.
Yeah, the user-facing is fine. I think the dev ones are like non-existent almost. Yeah.
I remember debugging the audit violation code like 3 years back. That was not fun when I first started using Gatekeeper.
Okay. Oops.
I mean, I actually didn't know the patterns and all. That was even before I started looking into Kubernetes code. So I was like, what is this all writing? I was literally putting debugger and debugging the whole thing. So I actually
have come home.
Is what I'm saying.
Our chickens have come home to roost, Rita.
What?
What? I'm saying consequences have arrived.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of that thing that Alex was working on. I was like, who did this? And I went to look at it, like, I made that change back in 2019 and I forgot about it. I was like, who did this? Git blame is awesome.
And then you're like, who made this change? And then you do it, and it's like, oh.
I know. I was like, oh my God, I was going crazy. I was like, why is Gatekeeper different from Kubernetes? I was like, why? I'm talking about like the delete object, right? I was like, why do we see it, but then Kubernetes doesn't see it? What's going on?
Yeah, that was, if I remember right, that was motivated by a user issue.
Yeah, it was. All of these were, but it's just like, forgot that we added that part. And then you check for consistency and you're like, wait, is Kubernetes docs lying? That was like the first thing I thought about.
Could not be us. Never, never.
I mean, it could just be it's out of date. Right?
Yeah, I forget the specifics, but there was some weirdness around like a specific K8s version with delete, like specifically, right?
I think 115. Or yeah.
Oh wow. So that is, we no longer like support, literally. I think we are broken on 115.
No, nobody.
Yeah, we need 116 minimum.
Yeah.
Because of, I think, CRDs or the webhooks or something. Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah, I forget.
any other topics? Or you can
I think we still need to revisit the enforcement action stuff. But I think, do we have any new topics for that one?
I didn't do any changes on the doc, I don't think. Was I supposed to do anything this last week?
No. I think all of our homeworks were like go back and then try to think about like a simpler approach on 4 or 5.
We said to take time to think about how we can make the mapping more intuitive. That was the call to action.
That's right. I, for one, did not think about it. Sorry.
I also didn't think about it.
I mean, the current is pretty complex, I would say. I mean, users would get confused.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of the reasons that I don't want to like block everything because of this PR, because otherwise you might have to wait for a while.
Oh yeah. With regard to the message queue stuff, for sure. I think it's like fairly uncontroversial though that targeting a specific queue would be part of a send a message enforcement action, no matter like what shape the actual description of that enforcement action takes. So that's why I'm like fairly confident saying we'll probably want this.
What about the default value for enforcement action? Do we still want to wait on that one? I'll drop it in the chat. This is more like a cosmetic change, I would say.
Yeah, the setting the default value. Well,
Yeah.
So the thing that makes it a bit less than a cosmetic change is right now we have the ability to say like unset, right? Which might make it a little easier to have backwards compatibility with whatever we dream up. Whereas if everything is set, right, we'll no longer be able to determine between a user who has registered specific intent versus someone who just didn't bother and said, just give me the default action. Which, as I said, might make it a little harder to design a backwards compatible change to how enforcement action works. The other risk I see with just having enforcement action in the response as a single item anyway, is if we want to like separate out enforcement action such that a constraint can take multiple actions, Kubernetes is not going to be able to like fold in multiple values into one, right? So deny is a default action to be taken, but the difference is that we do not, right now we can tell whether someone specifically said just deny or whether someone said just do whatever you do for default, right? So that's what we would be losing. And it's probably not like insurmountable problem, all right, to make that backwards compatible. It's just an impact that does affect that calculus. And the other side of it is like, how tenable is this column anyway? Also thinking about it, like, is that column about enforcement action, or is it really about severity, right? Like, are people interested in the action meant to be taken, or are they interested in, okay, there's a thing that I don't want to have any violations on, like for cereals, and it has 5 of them.
What do you mean? Five of what? Sorry.
So let's say a constraint has 5 violations, right? I think the intent behind listing the enforcement action would be like, oh, if it's dry run, who cares because it's dry run, right? Whereas if it's deny, that's something I said I don't want to have happen, and there's violations. But I'm wondering if, like, from a user perspective, they're less interested in the enforcement action and more interested in some like severity gauge, right? Where it's like, do not violate versus like advisory or something like that.
Yeah, I think we already say total violations in here, right? This is just.
We say total violations, but right now we have.
I think this is more like a shortcut. So like, say you don't have to describe the constraint to see it.
I appreciate that, but my question is, when you're viewing that shortcut, are you interested in the enforcement action that the constraint was meant to take, or are you just using that as a proxy for how much you care about the fact that there are violations on that constraint?
Could be both.
Yeah, because if it's severity, like, we could come up with a different channel for that. If it's enforcement action, we get into this, as I said, folding problem, right? And
I mean, I think it's just like the UX is, it just basically says empty there, and then users wouldn't know that deny might be the default one.
right. So, but and again, putting on the user empathy hat, why are they looking at it, right? Like, if this is a UX problem, we should try to satisfy the thing that the user is actually looking for when they are listing at this level.
Yeah, hard for me to say something like, hey, they're looking at this thing.
I think there is an implicit default that is not obvious to someone who hasn't been using Gatekeeper for a while.
Right, and there's 2 ways we could take this, right? Maybe 3. We could remove that field entirely, right? That would be problem solved in a way. We could do the proposed fix, which is like set the default value when undefined, which we know, like, if we do multi-enforcement action, that reporting is broken then anyway, because there's no one true enforcement action at that point, right? It's not just deny, it's deny plus send to operations for a security threat or something, right? So in that case, we'll fix it and then like break it almost, within the foreseeable future. Or if we would look at it and we decide that actually the intent behind having the enforcement action was really, we had conflated this notion of the importance of the constraint with the enforcement action it was meant to take, then we can just change it to report severity instead of enforcement action, and give users a place to specify the relative severity of a constraint.
I guess to your point, if they really want to know the enforcement action, they can always just dump the YAML and see it, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that's why I think like when you have this top level view stuff, really what you're looking for is either something like, okay, which constraint has violations? Because I saw from the metrics, there's like 5 violations on my cluster, right? That's one way of using that like high level data. The other way would be to say, okay, given that I know this constraint has violations, do I care, right? And I don't want to parse the YAML to know if I care or not. And that to me sounds like severity. The enforcement action stuff, I think is is like loosely correlated with severity. Like you would tend to want to deny stuff, but not absolutely correlated, right? Because there's certain constraints that have operational risk, right? Something on kube system you might not want to set to deny. Okay, but anyway, that's from a user perspective what I'm thinking about.
Okay, let's revisit this, I guess, since we're on time now.
Yep.
Yep.
Right. Bye.